Hello, my name is Virgil Wood, and I'm just delighted today that my dear friend and colleague from many, many years, Dr. Harvey Cox, and I will have a chance to share some things about our journey together and what there might be in our journey that is useful to the people who will be here doing things that in their time will match parallel things that we did in our time. Harvey, it is a delight to be here today. And we have the opportunity just to share some of our journey. I think, particularly, how we came together, the communities that we were both a part of. We both work with Martin Luther King, and especially our work in Boston and what the relevance that has for today, and particularly how universities and faith groups and political and business all can now probe Martin Luther King's fascination with beloved community, which he did not have time to unfold very much. I think we are kind of in agreement that for the most part, society is still using beloved community kind of as a tagline. And we have a chance now to talk about some of the things that King may have helped us understand if he had not been robbed of the opportunity of more time. So, Harvey, it's just a delight to be here today together, and it's like old times in so many ways.
Yes, it is. It is a delight. And this opportunity today has given me some opportunity for reflection and memory. I do a lot of reflecting and memories nowadays. I guess most of us do in our age cohort. But I remember full well uh, when my family and I moved into Roxbury in 1963. My wife and my two children, I had another child while we were there. Now, this was a decision we made as a family. Here we were in the age we thought of really changing American society and really having done with this kind of racist toxin. And we thought everybody's talking about breaking down the walls of segregation and all that. For a lot of people, that meant bringing black people into white neighborhoods and white institutions. Well, I said, this ought to go both ways. And we already knew some people who had moved to Roxbury. Roxbury was and still is principally the area in Boston where people of African descent have settled and continued to live. And although it's not the only place, it was the principal place then.
Right.
So 1963, we moved into Wayne Street in Roxbury. And you already lived in Roxbury, of course. You were there with the Blue Hill Christian Center.
Right.
And one of the first things that happened was there was a knock on the door, and you appeared to welcome us to the neighborhood. You may have forgotten this. And you brought along a pie. The pie you had purchased at the Muslim bakery, right?
Oh, yeah, bean pie.
So we took the pie in, and we thought this is a real welcome. And we went. So we lived there from 1963 until 1970, when we eventually moved to where I live now, right here in Cambridge. But that's another story. So while I was there, one of the principal reasons I moved there was, of course, you and a couple other people had established this center, this kind of beachhead, if you will, or kind of a headquarters or outpost in Roxbury, with some sponsorship, I should say, from the then Andover Newton Theological School.
Right, yeah.
And you were brought on here from Virginia as the director of that center.
Right.
And you grabbed a hold of it and really made something out of it. And it was a big part of my life at the time. It was where the action was.
Yeah.
If anything was going to happen in Boston, it was especially in the area of racial justice. Blue Hill was at the center of it. So that's my memory of the start of it all. And I'll pause now and see if any of it clicks with you.
Oh, my Lord, yes. I'm just, I feel I feel overwhelmed with delight as I think about that. Here was a community called McCall, when he was a student at Andover Newton, had begun this work.
That's
He'd been
right.
a member of St. Mark United Church of Christ, grew up there,
Right.
and of course we know his unfolding years took him right to the candidates of governor of New York. He had
That's right. He ran for governor of New York.
and he told me recently, Harvey, that he's doing his memoir and and
Ah.
and wanted to, kind of refresh his own memory about our time and how that happened.
I remember when he was a member of St. Mark's Church in Roxbury and a
Right.
student at Andover Newton, and
Right.
he asked me
Right.
actually to preach at his ordination,
Uh-huh.
which I did at St. Mark's.
Oh my Lord.
Well, a while back, nobody
Yeah.
knew quite the future in politics that he had at the time, but everybody knew he was going to go somewhere.
Oh yes, yes. He was destined for the stars. It's where he is now. He's right there. It's a major force in New York world and nationally. But Harvey, also I remember how you and some students of Andover Newton had gone to Wilmington, North Carolina. And in fact, the day I was inaugurated on the Hill at Andover Newton,
Yeah.
we enjoyed the story together. President Herbert Dessort, one of the
Yes.
great leaders of our time, had come out of Germany with his wife and family, and now he's president of Andover Newton. When you and some of the Andover Newton students had gone to Wilmington, the boy, Williamston, that's it,
Yeah.
Williamston. You and at the fall meeting on the Hill convocation, he remarked that the board had said to him, "When are you going to fire that faculty and put those students out?" I remember so well. I was sitting there and hear him say, he said, "Who do they think I am?" And he raised his hand and said, "The Fuhrer! I am not the Fuhrer. I'm the president of it." And he refused to back down from the support.
That's true. God bless him.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Now, he'd been through that in Germany and he saw it happening here. And
Yeah.
he put himself immediately, with all the difficulties and criticisms that flowed into him, right where he should have been. He was wonderfully supportive to us. I actually responded to an invitation myself to go down to Williamston and participate in the demonstrations at Southern Christian Leadership Conference was happening there. Sarah Small, as you may recall, was the
Sarah Small.
local leader. And when some of my students found out that I was down there, unbeknownst to me, 4 of them just climbed in a car and drove the whole way to Williamston to back me up. And when we eventually got arrested for being in this demonstration, they were all arrested too. So we were all in jail together, along with 40 people from Williamston, including a lot of the young people from the choir, and Sarah Small and some others. No, that was a golden moment.
When we recall and get on paper our story out of Boston, right now, Boston celebrates King around his days as a student there. They don't seem to have had much taste for celebrating King's work in Boston. When he marched 40,000 people on the Boston Common, and
Yes.
Bobby, you and I are both part of that leadership. Jim Breeden, who's recently has gone home to be with the Lord, and Phyllis Ryan. We remember Phyllis.
Oh yes, who could forget Phyllis Ryan?
Phyllis Ryan with great fun.
She's a great publicist.
She was. She
Yeah.
helped to make that event what it became.
Yeah.
Martin told me, Harvey, that event raised him, and he received it, more money than any other city had raised and given him.
Uh-huh.
He says, now, other cities raise more money, but I don't see it. He said they think that they got to spend big money to entertain me when I come. So they raise money and spend half of it trying to entertain me. But when he got that check for $113,000, this was in 1965.
That was a lot of money then.
That was a pretty good piece of change.
Yeah.
65.
Yeah.
But he told me, he said, Staff who hadn't been paid in months got paid. Everybody was really happy. That made me kind of a folk hero, Harvey, in the
I bet.
SWC upper echelons. In fact, Daddy King adopted me after that. In fact, one of the stories that I love is he tried to get me in as president of ITC. If Dr. Mays presided over the interview, I laughed because God didn't want me there. But you know what happened? I've always been an explainer and a storyteller. So I'm going on in this meeting, and Dr. Mays is presiding, and he reaches over to the person next to him. You know how old folks, they think they're whispering?
Yeah.
And he says, he's long-winded, isn't he? I love it. I love it. I love it. But Harvey, out of our work in Boston, has come the closest thing to an economic dimension to beloved community. And out of that work, recently I had the opportunity about 12 years ago to create a Martin Luther King PhD studies program with the Union Institute University in Cincinnati, where people can do online for the most part. We have mentored 31 PhDs on some dimension of modern work. There's 50 in the pipeline right now. But one of those has done a dissertation on why beloved community is not complete until you get the beloved economy that goes with it.
Right.
Those two things are two sides of the same reality. And I think that if we could delve a little more deeply into the genius of Josiah Royce and his, connection with Harvard, but also University of California and UCLA, that would be so helpful for people who want to understand more about, the depth of that concept, beloved community, beloved economy.
Yeah, that's I think it's absolutely integral, and you've been saying that ever since I've known you. I mean, to have, I think you quoted Dr. King one time. He said, "What's the point of being able to go in and sit down at a lunch counter if you don't have 50 cents for the sandwich?"
Right.
It's these are integral. No, I think that's true. I wanted to remind you, by the way, that the day that Dr. King came to Boston was April 23rd.
Yes.
And we sat around in the planning group and say, what are we going to call this day? Dr. King Day or what? And somebody, I think it was Phyllis Ryan with her gift for publicity, who said, what day is it going to be? We thought it's going to be April 23rd. Let's call it April 23rd for Martin Luther King.
Yes.
All in one phrase, April 23rd for Martin Luther King.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Then. So that was all over the place, plastered up, and given publicity. The day before, somebody from Dr. King's office said, well, got to postpone this for a day. You can't do that. We got April 23rd etched in people's minds. You got to come on April 23rd. And I think he did, too. I think it was on April 23rd. And it was a big, big, big event. It was a big event.
It was.
And I just heard the figure that you just mentioned. A lot of money for the cause was raised that day. It was a memorable event. Big event. But let's go back. I'm glad you brought up the figure of Josiah Royce.
Yeah.
Because you promised me we might say a word or two about him. Mm-hmm. And I've been rereading some of the things I've read in the past about Josiah Royce. He was a philosopher at Harvard. You may have heard of him, Ralph. I'm not sure. He died in 1915, so his prominent time here was, say, from 1900 to 1915. But he was one of the shining beacons of American philosophy at the time. And let me tell you something now that neither of you may know. While he was teaching at Harvard, one of his students was W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
Did you know that, Virgil?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Among other people, was W.E.B. Du Bois. He was very. I'm talking about Royce now. He was very, very interested in what goes into making a community, and the reason he came to that philosophically was that he believed that everything in the entire universe, every bit of created matter, persons, everything else, everything was interrelated. Everything was interrelated. There was nothing that was isolated. But in order to be interrelated, it had to be known from his philosophical point of view, and therefore
Yes.
there must be a knower, someone who knows
Yeah.
all of these individuals of all history, of everything, every person had to be known. So there was a knower. He went on from then to say there had to be a community of knowers, who would collectively know everything. I'll be omniscient, but not. It was something we were moving toward as human beings. We weren't there yet to this community. He called it at first the absolute community. The absolute, sort of as the goal of community was to be all inclusive. Everybody was a part of it. Everything was known. Everything was treasured. Everything was valued. The absolute community. And then toward the end of his life, and I'm almost finished my little disquisition here, the last 2 years he was at Harvard, 1913 and 14 and 15, he gave a seminar in which he began to use the term beloved community. This was a beloved community. And I'm not sure whether Dr. King got that phrase from him or not. I thought maybe you might know, Virgil, or whether they came upon it independently.
You know, there's a group of black scholars at the time. Oh, first of all, there was another student of Royce by the name of Alain Locke. He was the founder of the philosophy department of philosophy at Howard.
At Howard.
Alain Locke really understood Royce. Du Bois was somewhat confused about Royce. I won't go into that, except to say that there's a wonderful book called Frederick Douglass's Civil War. It's an inner war with Douglass, and the colon is, and after that, the subtitle is "Keeping Faith in Jubilee."
Keeping faith in Jubilee. All
That's
right.
right. And a historian over at Yale by the name of Blight, and you may know each other.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, he's a great historian on African American slavery, the whole American story. Incidentally, Harvey, I reached out to him. I'm looking forward to having some conversation also because he understood what King didn't understand, and also what Gandhi didn't understand, what Mandela didn't understand. Here's what I think it is. When you and what Isabel Wilkerson does understand, that we've been thinking that the issues were race and class, but it's more caste than race or class, because in the American big story, we've now gotten a black man in the White House, but we haven't dealt with class and race, right? So that in Black America now, Eugene Robinson has done a book called The Disintegration of Black America. In 65, there was one Black America. There are 5 now. But the one that we've got to think about is the one that's in the basement. That's where the caste is. And in the basement, it's not just black caste people. When Senator Byrd looked at his people in West Virginia, he said, and I'm going to use this word because we're going to have to talk this word until we can take the toxicity out of it. He said, my people have become white niggers, right? Now, I think that's very prescient commentary, because what he understood then is that if I put this a black man in the White House, he has already said, he said that King had said, I want to fix America for rich and poor, super rich, super poor, black, white, everything, right? That was his vision. But what King did not have time to figure out was that there was a Jubilee dimension to his work. In 1966, it's in the literature, his literature, he wanted to take a sabbatical, a whole year sabbatical. I wish he had done it. He might well still have been with us. The reflection that we did not do in the civil rights movement. We struck a blow to Jim Crow, but we kept jabbing after we'd knocked him out, and he revived, right? So that modern's legacy is still in intermission. We have not been into the upper room.
Ah,
We have not yet been into the upper room with King's potential legacy. Howard Stevenson, whom you are both know and love, says that there's no legacy if, when you're gone, no one finds value in the genius of what you left. The genius of King is what I like to call the Jubilee Beloved Community Playbook. And one way to see it in Christian literature is 1 Corinthians 13. As you know, that was a framework for all of Josiah Royce's work. As a philosopher, I think he was as much theologian as
oh,
philosopher.
he was. In fact, one of his principal books was on this. I think he called it the spirit of religion. He was
Yeah,
very interested in the philosophy of religion, and it's hard to separate out his philosophy from his religious thinking.
yeah,
Let me just add one thing that I hope you continue on this line. The
sure.
thing that Royce had a continuing argument with William James.
Yes, he
They
did.
were
Yes, yes.
they were both on the faculty here. I wish I could have sat in on some of those arguments, but
Right.
believe it or not, I wasn't here at the time. That was a little before my time. But William James was very interested in religion. His father was a minister,
Right.
and he was especially influenced by Swedenborg and that whole strain of things.
Right.
But he wrote this book, which is thought of as a classic, and in some ways it is, Varieties of Religious Experience. I think it came out about 1906 or so. But his interest was in what I would call esoterica. He was interested in unusual religious experiences, powerful mystical experiences, and sort of things that are sort of out of the ordinary. And that was not the case with Royce.
That's right.
Royce was interested in the religion of ordinary people, ordinary congregations.
Yes, yes.
What's it mean to them? What's it going to mean to us? And I think he was right. I think Royce was right in that respect. And William James, may he rest in peace.
May you rest in
I'm
peace.
almost sitting under the shadow of his building here, the William James Hall. I think he was not completely right on that.
Hmm. You know, another student of Josiah Royce, I mentioned Alain Locke, but Locke is considered to be the father of American adult education. He helped to create that association when they didn't even receive black folks. He's black, right? He helped to create that. And Leon Sullivan, whom we both knew,
Oh, yes, we did.
took the Locke version of Royce and created OIC. And then, when you talk about beloved community, you got to go back to John Ellison at Virginia Union, who was the first black president of Virginia Union, 1940. In 48, he gave a lecture at Alderson Broaddus in West Virginia on beloved community, and it's in his book called Tensions and Destiny. Ellison was president in 48. I went there in 40. He became president for the first black. Incidentally, Virginia Union had depended on Andover Newton for its presidents up till then. Interesting. Andover Newton is gone, and I'm saddened by that fact. And there is a major African American component to the Andover Newton legacy, and I'll be talking with them about that. And Harvey, you can help us on this too. We both have Andover Newton, in our background,
Yes.
but also the work of Blight over there will help us, because Andover Newton is on that Yale campus now, and the Andover Newton legacy is, and our work in Boston is one important part of that. I call the name Paul Dunn right now because Paul was the comptroller of Andover Newton at the time. Went all out to help make that happen.
He
And
did.
one of these days, I want us to have some kind of memorial to Paul Dunn, as well as to other great people at Andover Newton. There was John Scammon. He was my Hebrew teacher, and we had great times with John. That was Paul Minear from Yale, out of Yale and back to Yale, the New Testament. There you were, Harvey, early in your career.
That's where I started teaching seminary at
Yeah.
Andover Newton.
How long were you on faculty at Harvard?
Very short time, 2 or 3 years
So,
before I came to Harvard.
yeah, that's right. Your years at Harvard, say a little bit about that, because especially later in along, you were asked to do a course on Jesus for Harvard College.
Yes, I
I
was.
love that story. And I think people ought to look for your book on that too. But if you would share a little bit about that, I just love that story.
Yeah, well, here's what happened. This was 25 years ago, but the administration at Harvard was getting a little embarrassed by these revelations of some, you might say, ethical creativity on the part of some Harvard grads, including business school grads, who were uh, uh, not anything that the university wanted to be proud of. And they started discussing this, and they said, well, look, we're teaching everything here. We're teaching math, we're teaching history, we're teaching physics. Is anybody teaching ethics or morality or anything like this? Values? They all looked at each other and said, well, I guess not. And so they decided to institute for all Harvard undergraduates had to take a course called moral reasoning
Uh-huh.
in order to graduate. Somebody joked that they had to do two things. They had to take a course in moral reasoning, and they had to swim 100 yards. And so they said, okay, moral reasoning is going to be in the catalog now. Now, who can teach that? Well, they looked at each other. Well, we better not just rely on people here at the School of Arts and Sciences of Harvard College. There are people in other divisions of the university. So they asked me to come in and meet them, and they said, you know, when we think about this business of moral reasoning, there ought to be one course, don't you think, on Jesus? I mean, Jesus has been pretty influential in the moral reasoning of people over a few hundred years, but we don't have anybody who can teach that. And I mentioned to you, Virgil, when I finally agreed to teach it, they said, well, nobody's taught this for very long. So I went to the catalogs in the Harvard library to look up when the last course had been given, 1912. And the person who offered the course was George Santayana. The Harvard, the rather idiosyncratic but brilliant Harvard philosopher, gave a course in 1912 on Jesus. So there was a bit of a backlog of people who were interested in this. So I started giving this course, and nobody knew. I mean, they had a choice of 10 courses they could choose from in moral reasoning. And I was the only one that had a course on Jesus. I called it Jesus and the Moral Life. Jesus and the Moral Life was the title of the course. I walked in the first day. There were 600 students in that. They were lined up to get into that course. And I thought, oh, geez, is there a lot of interest in Jesus, or what is this? Or maybe this is the backlog since 1912. So I started teaching this course, and it turned out there was a lot of interest among a lot of students, and they weren't all church kids. I mean, there was every year I tried to find who was in there. There were some, of course, who took the course because mommy and daddy thought they ought to take a course on Jesus because they belonged to the Presbyterian church in town or whatever. But there were Jewish kids, there were Buddhists, there were Muslims, there were kids without any religion at all, and that persuaded me that Jesus is a lot bigger than Christianity. Jesus is a lot bigger than the church. Jesus has a much, much, much wider swath, and we ought to take advantage of that and not try to make him something that we control or that we package or something like that. He doesn't do well with packages, Jesus. He breaks out of these things when they try to conflict with him. So that was the course. I taught that course for 12 years. And sometimes there were more students than that. Sometimes I got up to 700-800 students in the course. In fact, one time, the president, who was then Derek Bach, president of Harvard, called me up and said, Yeah, I'd like to take you out to lunch. I think you out to lunch. I said, sure. So he took me out to a very fancy restaurant. He said, tell me what's happening. We got 800 students in that course. What's going on in there? So I tried to explain to him. And I think what got across to him was that whether it's this course or not, we do have some responsibility for the moral formation of our students. We just can't assume that they're going to pick it up on the side. They won't. It's got to be honored as something that's integral to the education of a educated person.
Harvey, that is just astounding. I think about one or two other persons who have been big in my life. One was Chris Odris,
Oh yeah,
was major in my dissertation, and then David McClellan, who was a world
David
authority.
McClellan. Yeah, yeah,
World
wonderful
authority was
man.
on my committee.
Was he?
And I remember I was running through that real fast, Harvey. I wanted to get out of there in 3 years. I did my doctorate in the School of Ed, as you know, but I did it in economics to go with my theology. And what I found out was that most of these movements had missed the economic dimension, even Fred Douglass. And I remember being at a luncheon with you, Harvey. You and I at a restaurant there in Cambridge Square, and you told me about one of the prominent scholars on the subject of Jubilee, and he was at that time a new professor at Union in New York. And you know exactly who I'm talking about, Letty Russell's husband. In 1966, the Union Quarterly carried his inaugural lecture. It was about Jubilee. He was Scandinavian, as I remember, and he got us on a track about the Jubilee. See, I had been, and when I was 17, I had spent a whole week with a man who'd been a slave. His years were like 1855 to almost 1955. So I sat with him in 48. Summer, I went to college. I'm 17. He's 93 at the time, something like that. He tells me about his memory the day they learned that Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The
He
Union.
remembered that?
He remembered. No, he
Oh,
was 10 years old, but he remembered. He remembered the discussion among the elders when the Union soldiers had come on the plantation there in Virginia, just 15, 20 miles out of Charlottesville. And the Union soldiers had come up and said, get all the slaves together. We want to share some with y'all. Took us 3 hours to get everybody together, something like that. He said, finally, the young man sat on his horse and read from this big paper. And when he finished, we didn't know what he'd been talking about. So he read it again. It looked like he will never stop reading. So finally, he said, this paper says that Mr. Lincoln has set you all free. He said, nobody knew what to make of that. He said, the old guru finally looked at the soldier and said, young man, whatever that is you say, Mr. Lincoln done for us, go back and tell Mr. Lincoln, thank you, Mr. Lincoln, but we know that the great God Almighty done give us the great Jubilee.
Oh, really? Use the word Jubilee there.
Yeah, he said they called it the Great Jubilee. They had been looking for the Great Jubilee because in those clandestine lessons and worship in the deep woods, they had learned about Jubilee. How would a people keep alive the hope of emancipation for 247 years if they hadn't met Jesus already in the deep woods? That brings us to the Black church. And it has a role now that we don't quite yet understand. And I believe, Harvey, that when you look at Genesis 50 and 17, when finally after Jacob's death, Jacob's boys go to Joseph and say, you know, Daddy said that when he was gone, we should come and apologize to you. Because if you would just allow us to be your slaves now, you know, we won't starve. That's when Joseph fell to pieces. He cried so loud that he was heard all over the kingdom. And that's when he learned whose dream it was. It wasn't his dream, it was God's dream all the time. He had been an instrument of the dream, but he wasn't conscious of what it really was.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Jonah,
Yeah.
saving all them people in Nineveh. And he was really put out with God for saving them. God said, no, no, these are my people. This is where the black Christian community of the world now is. We are in the driver's seat, but we don't know it yet. Some people are waking up to the fact that people think, I'm sure American folks have been buying all them guns because they knew that when black folks had the power to do to them what they did to us, we would be resentful. And what they didn't understand is the king said, no, we're not interested in any kind of retribution. We're interested in reconciliation,
Yeah.
building America as America says on paper. King used to say, just do what you put on paper. And that's King's legacy to us, is the Jubilee potential in America. I don't think it's anywhere else on the planet right now like it is in America. And if we're at 5 minutes to midnight, and when the clock strikes at midnight, America is over. I don't know if we're 5 minutes before midnight, 10 minutes, or 2 hours from midnight, but I do know this, that King had prepared his sermon for the following Sunday. He died on Thursday, prepared his sermon for Sunday, and he had sent the subject back to Ebenezer. He's going to preach a sermon called Why America May Go to Hell. Why America May Go to Hell. That was his sermon. I think we can revise that now, and the sermon might well have been, now that we know more about Jubilee, especially after Martin's mama's assassination,
Yeah.
and after Daddy King and George and John Lewis forgive George Wallace for all of that, they give George Wallace a ticket to heaven and he takes it. But here's where we are then. If we wake up to that possibility that God has put us in the seat, he didn't put us in the White House to be a blackface Ronald Reagan. I'm not going to call it a name, but he did not. And that's why Byrd said, I'm going to help put a black man in the White House, because he thought he was going to be Martin Luther King, but it was a blackface Ronald Reagan with a smile on his face. Maybe that POTUS that we've just had is really no more than also a Ronald Reagan with a frown on his face. I don't know whether it's a frown or the smile, but I do know this. If it's 5 minutes before midnight, we got to say, what have we done that causes our little babies to be committing suicide younger and younger in life? Suicide of children 7 and 8 and 9 years old. We've got to stop everything we are doing and say, how do we fix this? We've got to have a revolution that is really an evolution of our ancestors' dream. And I'm wondering how you see that, Harvey. What do you feel when you hear that?
Well, two things come to mind, Virgil. That's very, very well stated, just the way you put it. One is that the Jubilee goes way back, of course, to the Hebrews, who had a Sabbath of Sabbaths.
Right.
They had a Sabbath year. They had a Sabbath day every week. Then they had a Sabbath year every seventh year. And then every 49th, 7th of 7th, they had a Jubilee.
Right.
And this was not just a festive holiday. This was a time when all debts were canceled.
Yes.
And all mortgages were forfeited. And slaves went back to their homes. I mean, this was a real, it was a liberation. It was a built-in liberation into the Constitution of the people of Israel, because they knew, why would they have it every 49 years? Because they know that wealth and power have a way of building on themselves, and they've got to be challenged now and then. They've got to be undercut. Things have to be done over. That was what the Jubilee was about. Now, in that portion of the scripture where it talks about the Jubilee, it does 2 or 3 times, and one of them says, on the 49th year, proclaim liberty throughout the land,
and
unto all the inhabitants thereof.
All the inhabitants, yes.
Now, you know where that is? Where it is now?
Yes.
On the Liberty Bell.
Absolutely.
On the Liberty Bell, which I remind you has a crack in it.
That's cracking it.
Has a crack in it. But there it is. It's still there. I don't know whether they ring the Liberty Bell anymore, but it's been part of the American, you might say, inheritance.
Yes.
Uh, Sometimes at least acknowledged, many times not acknowledged. But it's there, and it's to be drawn upon, and it's not just a finery. This is a serious release of debts and release of captives. I mean, the prisoners go free. I mean, we don't have to go on with it. Now, let me just mention one other thing very shortly,
Sure.
and that is I've been reading recently some of the literature in the last 50 to 100 years on the decline of the West,
Yes.
the decline of the West, which people foresaw a long time ago and wrote about in various ways, sort of philosophy of history. Now, there were a number of different writers in that regard. Das Untergang des Abendlands was one of them. But then Toynbee, who wrote about 60, 70 years ago, and I read some Toynbee when I was in college, he said, well, the decline is not inevitable. All empires have declined. However, it's not inevitable. History shows that what saves a decadent and falling civilization is what Toynbee called a creative internal minority, a creative internal minority,
Mm.
which can turn the tide of history around. And I thought, boy, creative internal minority. Look around for what that might be in America. I think we can pretty well tell what it should be, what it should be. And I don't think Toynbee went that far. I mean, he was just talking about the historical parallels of an internal minority that could change things. Not necessarily, but they could. That they could play that role. And I think that ties in a bit to what you're saying about where Black people find themselves now, not just in America, but I mean, it's a global phenomenon, which could be extinguished if the big guys with the guns and the bombs decided they wanted to make sure this internal minority didn't get a chance to do anything. They have the power to undercut it or sweep it out, but it could happen.
Harvey, I'm so thrilled with this. When King gave his very last speech, the last time we heard his physical voice, he said, "We as a people will
Yeah.
get to the promised land." And I think that this creative internal minority is a jubilee minority, and they're all races, all ages, all of that. And I've had the privilege of the generosity of Virginia Tech and Virginia Union, and my dear friend Ralph Hall, who has been huge in this whole potential. And I'm hoping that as we wind up our conversation, Ralph will just give us some of his reflections on what he's heard here today. I want to give, I think, the credit to Virginia Tech that it deserves, because it has done more for advancing the vision of this thing. And I'm just so excited that Virginia Tech has hosted something we call the Beloved Community Ancestors Hall of Fame. In the American Big Story, the Transcendentalists of Boston, who talked about the uh, the uh, the arc of the moral universe being long, but it bends. And in the American Big Story, everywhere it bends, there's the impact of a black and a white somehow. And I think we're going to see this now as we look at Abraham Lincoln and Fred Douglass, for example. And we're going to find out how Douglass missed the Jubilee, but he was trying to deal with it. He didn't get there. And Blight's work at Yale there is going to help us understand that. I'm hoping he's going to be a part of these ongoing conversations, Harvey. But the other thing is that America now has a chance to blend the wisdom that Tillich talked about: love, power, and justice. When love and power fall in love with each other, the little baby is named Justice. And I'm trusting that we will follow those institutions that want to get this right. I'm just thrilled that the friendship and the relationship that Brother Ralph has brought to this work. And I want him just to maybe if he's willing to today or at a later time, just to give us any reflections he has based on what we've said here today. But before we do that, Harvey, I would like you to take the opportunity and just say any final words you want to say as far as today is concerned, because I'm just praying that our conversation together is going to go on beyond this taping.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank Virginia Tech too. If they had something to do with making this conversation possible, and I guess they really did, Ralph and the rest. It's just been marvelous to think back and to think ahead, think back and think ahead, which is what we've been trying to do here. You mentioned Paul Tillich, and as I was going back and reading more of Royce and his philosophy of loyalty, I was immediately reminded of Paul Tillich's understanding of concern and ultimate concern. His basic category was concern. He preferred that to faith or belief or anything. What is your real concern in life? What do you put your life into, your ultimate concern? And I think you'd almost substitute that word in the vocabulary of both of them, concern. Then, of course, you have to face the issue that you have multiple loyalties.
Yes.
You have multiple. You have your family, you have your community, you have the world, and they all dealt with that too. And the idea of an ultimate community, which is all inclusive, which includes everybody. You never quite get there. I don't think it's like the kingdom of God. It's there. It's pulling you. It's enticing you, but it's always in the future. And Royce once said that the mark of true greatness is to engage yourself seriously in projects, the end of which you will not see yourself.
Right.
In projects that are going to go on when you're gone. I'm convinced that Virgil, what you've been involved with is something that's going to continue to go on. But let me say again, I'm very grateful for what Virginia Tech has done. May their tribe increase.
I want to use my final time to mention something that Howard Thurman said. Martin's great mentor, that wonderful book, Jesus and the Disinherited, really is about Jubilee.
Yes.
I talked with Thurman. He wasn't explicit about Jubilee, but the substance of Jubilee is his Jesus and the Disinherited and so much else that he wrote. But Thurman said that hell, if you want to know what hell is, he said you are in your final days or your final hours of life. You may be on your deathbed. And he said, you may have just a few hours left to live or days and you don't really know. He says every one of your unfulfilled dreams will come in and stand around your deathbed. And one by one, they will say to you, why did you not try? Why did you not breathe life into us? And he said, sadly, you will realize it's too late. All of your breath is gone. All of your opportunity to do what you could have done even 5 minutes ago is now gone. He said, that's hell. So, Harvey, I think you and I have a good chance. The good Lord is one day welcome us into the pearly gates. But I love that we have worked on the pearly gates on earth as in heaven.
Yeah. Me too.
Yes, right. And Brother Ralph, if you have any comment you want to make now or make later, it would be deeply appreciated.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to get some insight into your 5 decades of working and collaborating together. That's been a real pleasure. Harvey, one of the things I was going to ask you about is I have your book here, The Market is God.
Oh, yes.
And I enjoyed looking at this and reading it when it came out. And I guess my question throughout the work, you talk about the religion of the market. And what I've what I'm thinking about is how do you see that impacting? We've talked about community. How do you see that religion of the market impacting community, and what can we do about it? And I think it connects back to your class even about moral reasoning.
Yeah.
So I'll be very curious to hear just maybe some final thoughts on that.
Well, when the market is doing what it's supposed to do, which is to be one of the institutions in the society that helps allocate goods and services for human need, it's perfectly okay. But when the market becomes the principal defining institution, deciding what the values are and deciding how to allocate things, and becomes manipulated by those who want to use the market, then it decimates community. It's a destructive force on community. So I think the last chapter in my book is called "Saving the Soul of the Market." I'm not for destroying the market, I'm for delivering it from its own excesses, which is what saving it means. And I think that's, if that doesn't happen, community is really, in any meaningful sense, is doomed.
Avi, now I've just got to have you to do one more thing here, and I'm trusting and hoping that we can have follow-up discussions. I'm sure there'll be feedback and discussions based on this tape, and maybe there's another tape we might want to do. But I want to suggest something. I've been in touch with several serious corporate people. You might call them Zacchaeus in the corporate world. We know that Warren Buffett has said that you're only successful when the people you love you. In other words, when you have love that's not based on transactions, then you've been successful. And I was so impressed with how Warren Buffett has gotten billionaires of the world together and said, you've got to give this money away by the time you die.
Yeah.
Now it went from there to half of it. I think that's a function of the lack of imagination we have, by which people with serious money could park that money and help the community. I think we've gotten mixed up on the love of money and the money of love. I think there is a money of love that is the means and not the ends. And perhaps that's something we'll take up at another time. But I just wondered if, in the light of what Ralph has raised about the market.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure, we should do that. I'm up for that. And he's not the only one, by the way. There are plenty of people in the whole corporate world who have deep and abiding ideals.
Yes.
And when you're talking to them, they'll all tell you that they feel they feel confined.
Right.
And unable to do what they want to do because of the structures of the market economy. You could help them find their way through that without having to get to the very, very, very top the way he has, but to begin to exercise their God-given freedom even before that.
Deepest thanks, and as your friend and mine, Duke Ellington would say, I love you madly. Love you madly. You and Ralph, I love you madly, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.